What's up, loyal poker listeners? This is Characters, and welcome back to the Carrot Poker Podcast. I hope you like my entrance music. It's something I should have done in the first 7 episodes. I think there's been 7 episodes. I'm pretty sure this is number 8, but I've certainly done it now because one of my students was like, "Hey, Carrot Man, why the hell do you not have entrance music? Like, every good wrestler and also every good podcast maker has intro music, so what are you doing?" So I thought, okay, that tune is like one of my favourite tunes. They're from a band that are very local to me, actually, from Scotland, that not many people know about, but they're awesome. They're called Big Hand. You should check them out. Anyway, this is an episode where I'm not going to be interviewing anyone or being interviewed by anyone. It's going to be me talking to me about poker, and specifically I'm kicking off what I'm going to call a sort of intermediate series that's going to sort of come and go in between student interviews, and this series is going to be called Curing the Spots You Hate. And the idea is that every week on a Sunday or Monday when this episode comes out, sometime between those 2 days, depending on how long iTunes takes to actually publish it, you will tune in to find out which spot that you most undoubtedly hate, because it's really unpleasant in poker. I'm going to be sort of busting and showing you guys how to fix and how to actually get some clarity as to how to play, so you can start feeling so troubled by these situations. And I'm selecting the spots that you hate based on what my students tell me. And I think that I've coached hundreds of people over the last few years, and I think that overall they represent very accurately the kind of struggling demographic of the aspiring grinder. Today's episode is going to be about this. I 3-bet ace king and I missed the flop. Now what? So if you miss the flop with ace king, you might feel as if, oh man, this was such a great hand, it was such a clear 3-bet pre-flop, and now the flop has come all horrible for me and I'm out of position and I need to choose between one of 3 or 4 really disgusting options. Do I check call? Do I check fold? Do I c-bet? Do I check raise? What do I do? Nothing seems really very appealing to me. This is such a common situation because ace king is combinatorially one of the most frequent hands you're going to be 3-betting with. In fact, you will 3-bet ace king. In fact, more than you will 3-bet any other hand, because while you always 3-bet aces and you usually 3-bet ace king, there are 6 combos of aces and there are 16 combos of ace kings. You get dealt ace king way more often, almost 3 times as frequently as you get dealt pocket aces. So this is the hand that you're going to be dealing with the most when you 3-bet. That's a fact. And because ace king has 2 big cards, it is going to miss the flop. Well, it's not going to flop a pair any more than a third, slightly under a third of the time. So you're going to actually flop less than 1 pair pretty damn often, with there only being 3 aces and 3 kings left for you to hit out of the 50 cards that are remaining, that are unknown to you. So yeah, you're going to be always in this situation where you 3-bet ace king, you miss the flop, not always, but most of the time, you're going to find yourself in this spot, and it's a sticky spot, and we want to find out what we should do to make it less awkward for you. So I want to start off just by asking, why do we 3-bet ace king pre-flop? This might lead us to an answer as to how we can actually approach this dilemma. So we 3-bet ace king for value. I think that should go without saying. That it's very rare that we'd be in some weird situation where we'd be like 3-betting ace king as a bluff pre-flop because we couldn't call with it. That's just kind of bizarre. Either we're going to flat ace king because we think it's too thin to 3-bet for value, or we're going to 3-bet it for value. These are really the only 2 kind of situations that are going to come up pre-flop with ace king. We're going to squeeze it, 3-bet it for value, or we're going to elect not to. We're not going to be bluffing with it. So given that we're doing that for value, what that means is that we think that when we 3-bet and get called or get continued against in some way, that our ace king is going to be ahead of the range that continues against us. What that means is that even when we miss the flop, our ace king is still oftentimes going to have significant equity against our opponent's range. For example, when it's behind to a lower pocket pair on a 10 high board, when it's behind like a hand like 9s or jacks or 10x on that flop, it's still going to have 6 outs to, most of the time, it's going to have 6 outs to making the best hand. So when it's behind, it's not dead, and when it's actually ahead, it's usually in very good shape indeed and can often be dominating our opponent's lesser broadways. So first thing just to make clear is that when we miss the flop with ace king, we're not tied to sort of like check folding and giving up because woe is us, we didn't flop top pair. Oftentimes our hand is actually still quite formidable when we miss the flop, and there are other times when it's actually not formidable at all and it's actually really crap and pathetic and we should just check folding because we don't have a better option. And there's a third kind of time when our hand is actually, well, let me start by saying the 3 different lines we could take here. We could check fold, which would be the absolute worst when our hand has flopped the worst of the worst and we don't think that we have any fold equity at all. So when we flop a very weak hand with ace king, we should probably be looking to check fold. And these would be situations where the board is kind of wet, like the board texture is not in our favour, because in order for us not to have any fold equity and for us to have really bad pot equity, we need to have missed a flop quite majorly, and the flop needs to be like fairly wet or fairly good for our opponent's range. So that would be the first one. I'm going to give you guys an example of all of these in just a minute. So that would be a time to check fold. So you can miss the flop in the way that your hand just sucks and your opponent's not folding enough, therefore you don't have an option as to how you continue. You just can't really continue in the hand. But that's not the only way that you can miss the flop. It's far too much of a generalization to say you either hit the flop, you either hit your top pair, a massive, amazing, godlike kicker, or you miss the flop. It's just not that simple. Way one that you miss is that you miss in such a bad way that you actually just have to check fold the hand. But there are two more ways that you can miss the flop with ace king, and I think distinguishing these from the first one is going to be the key to figuring out when you should give up in the hand and when there's a better alternative available to you. So way two that you can miss the flop is when you have a fairly weak hand, but you think that you've got sufficient, here's the key, pot equity, so just your equity in the hand, like do you have outs when behind, do you have overcards, etc, when behind. So you think you've got sufficient pot equity, maybe with a backdoor flush draw as well, backdoor straight draw, or even a gut shot if you're really lucky, and do you think you have sufficient fold equity? So if you have enough of these two things, you can definitely go ahead and c-bet, and you can actually make the assertion quite rightly that c-betting is better than check folding, because check folding is a zero EV play from the point of post-flop. You might say, what are you talking about, Carrot Man? Check folding obviously loses all that money you put into the pot pre-flop. It does, if you want to look at the overall EV of the hand, but that's not how we calculate EV from point of decision. Like when we're figuring out which line is best, we take a line that puts no money into the pot and risks and loses no money at the same time. We call that zero EV. So checking and then folding to a bet is always a zero EV line. And if we think that we have enough pot equity and fold equity for c-betting to actually make us money in the long run, then we're saying that c-betting is a plus EV line, and we should definitely favour that to check folding. So we can c-bet when we have a fairly weak hand, we've missed the flop in a kind of fairly bad way, but we think we've got enough of those two things for c-betting to be plus EV, so that's what to look for there. We're going to look at some examples very soon, but the third way in which you can miss the flop is when you actually still have mammoth showdown value. So you could actually, you could think that your opponent's range is actually so weak that even though you just have ace king high, the board might be pretty dry, and you might just think your opponent has worse than ace king high very often. And in this situation, check folding is completely out of the question, and you could c-bet. You could make an argument for c-betting if you wanted to play in a balanced way, where you were actually c-betting your whole range on that flop because you thought that you just had range advantage over your opponent and you just wanted to put him in a spot where his whole range would struggle to defend. So you could c-bet in this situation as well. But if we want to talk about what might be highest EV in a vacuum, and that's what I'm going to do for this podcast, the way to play this third type of scenario when you have a lot of showdown value and your opponent's got air a lot is to check call. This makes the most sense. Against airy ranges, especially ones where we think our opponent is going to bet himself, we want to favour check calling and bluff catching over c-betting and folding out the worst hands that we're completely crushing and getting called by all the pairs that are ahead of us. So those are three different ways that you can miss the flop with ace king. You can miss it completely, scenario number one, where you just have insufficient pot equity and fold equity to c-bet. You don't have enough showdown value to check call because your opponent's range is too strong, and your opponent just doesn't have that much air in his range. So that's scenario one, and you want to be folding that spot. An example of this situation is when you have ace king, and you're in the hijack as hero, and villain is in the hijack, and you're in the small blind as hero, and you 3-bet and villain calls, and the flop comes down queen 9-7 2 tone, meaning the queen 9-7 flop has two different suits on it, which implies that it has two of the same suit, and therefore a possible flush draw already, as well as some backdoor draws. So what we've flopped here, let's say we don't have any backdoors, we've just flopped ace king high. At most our equity is like a backdoor gut shot if like a jack or a 10 turns, so it's pretty damn poor. We do have two overcards, but oftentimes because a queen is on board here, our opponent's going to be playing a bunch of Broadway hands that have queens in them, like ace queen, king queen, queen jack, queen 10 suited, queen 9 suited, hands like this that are going to be calling our 3-bet in this situation. So given he has all these ace queen and king queen combos most likely, we are just not going to get enough fold equity here by betting, because we're going to struggle on this queen 9-7 texture to find enough air that our opponent can have here. If he has a pocket pair, like a medium pocket pair, like 7s plus, he's either got a set or has a pair that's definitely not going to fold right away, that would have to apply a lot of pressure later on in the hand to get folds from. And if he has a queen in his hand, he's obviously flopped top pair and got what he's looking for, and clearly not going to be folding this board either. So this presents significant difficulty for us with ace king to get enough fold equity plus pot equity. The idea is that when our c-bet gets called, we weren't getting enough folds in the first place, and we now don't have enough equity for that c-bet to be plus EV. So that c-bet would actually be minus EV. It would be putting in money into the pot in this situation most of the time. Obviously, you get a specific read that makes c-betting here good, like your opponent's a net versus c-bets. But most of the time, it's going to make this minus EV and an inferior alternative to just check folding the flop. So that's a spot to check fold when you just flop a very weak hand, queen 9-7, you've got ace king, there's just not enough pot equity and fold equity, you just should be done with the hand. So that's like the lowest tier of how badly you can miss the flop, basically. It doesn't get that much worse. I mean, you can probably fathom even worse situations, like the flop came 8-7-6 of spades and you have ace king of diamonds. That's definitely another situation where your ace king falls into the realms of just having insufficient fold equity, pot equity, showdown value, you name it. In that case, with a monotone board, even when your opponent does have like worse broadways, he has a flush draw and you don't a huge amount of time, he's actually going to be like doing fine equity wise because of that, and it's going to be the guy applying the pressure in position on later streets if you stop betting. So in all of these spots where your hand is just really hopeless and you just have insufficient showdown value, pot equity, and fold equity, one last time to summarize those three important things, you should check fold. You don't have enough of the good stuff to continue there, but that's just one way that you can miss the flop with ace king, and already you're in a better position now because you've identified a more specific way of missing the flop and you know how to play that specific way. Way number 2 that I mentioned was when you actually have enough fold equity and pot equity to c-bet, but you don't think that your hand is so good that you don't think it's like the best made hand so often that you want to go ahead and check call and start bluff catching. So check fold is way number 1. Way number 2 is c-betting. This is like in the middle when you have a fairly weak missed the flop hand, and these categories are not taken into account the times you actually hit the flop with ace king. That is a whole separate thing for a whole separate podcast or video or lesson or whatever. Way number 2, you should c-bet when you have enough fold equity and pot equity, but you don't have enough showdown value to turn your hand into like a bluff catcher and start check calling. An example is that Hero is in the small blind again, and this time it's a cutoff that opens, and Hero has the red ace king of hearts in the 4-color deck, and Hero decides to 3-bet for value, as he standardly will, from the small blind in this spot, and villain calls. And the flop comes 10 of hearts, 8 of something, 3 of something. So Hero has flopped a backdoor flush draw and has 2 overcards, basically. This is still missing the flop, but arguably this is much less severe than missing the flop in hand 1, where there was queen 9-7 two-tone and we didn't have any backdoor flush draws, and our opponent could have all that queen x as made top pair as well as other pairs that aren't folding. Here on 10-8-3 rainbow, our opponent doesn't have as many flush draws to continue with. The overcards he does have are not flopping top pair that often because people defend way more queen x to 3-bets than they do 10x because queen is bigger than 10. Kind of simple concept there. And so given villains just missing this flop way more frequently, we're going to have more fold equity, and we also have more pot equity because we have the backdoor flush draw and 2 very clean overcards that are not going to be dominated. If an ace or king comes in this situation, it's actually us who are going to be doing the dominating of villain because we're going to be dominating his missed broadways like king queen, ace jack, that kind of thing. In hand 1, when we're in check fold territory, it was the opposite because if villain was calling us with top pair already, then when a king or ace rolls off, oftentimes it either kills our action or just makes him 2-pair and puts us in a very dominated spot. So this situation, for all of those reasons, is a lot better. Scenario 2, we can definitely c-bet 10-8-3 with the backdoor flush draw here because we just reasoned that villain's going to have to fold enough of his broadways. Yes, those are worse hands, but it doesn't mean we don't want them to fold because we get to protect some equity, and we also get to just basically prevent us from being in a weird position where we check, and then this is a texture that, although there are some good turn cards for us that we can call again on if we check call the flop here as a bluff catcher on this 10-8-3 rainbow board, there are also a lot that we just hate, like any kind of, I guess, any 9 or 7 or 6 or 10 or, okay, 10 isn't horrible, but there's just a lot of cards that just do nothing for a hand, the ones that aren't hearts, basically. And even turns like jacks and queens that give us like a gut shot, if they're not hearts, they don't really give us a hand that we're thrilled about check calling again. So even on some of the better non-heart turns for us, we're going to struggle to check call like multiple streets here, because there are a lot of cards that can come on this turn, though the board's not wet immediately on the flop, that the board can become wet, and then our opponent's equity can either be improved by him making a better made hand, or by just picking up a load of semi-bluffing equity against us, and he's going to have a very easy time sort of applying pressure and position against us on this board that can deteriorate pretty fast for us. So this is not the driest of the dry boards. It's a dry board, but it's not like completely what I would call bone dry. So, and it's not a board that our opponent misses all the time. There are some hands in his range for opening in the cutoff and then calling our 3-bet that can actually hit this flop. Like he can have like ace 10, king 10 suited, those suited broadways with 10s in them for sure. And he can also have like some sets here and even a few combos of 8x, like possibly 8-9 suited, I don't know. So all in all, this is like too good a hand to check fold, this second tier of missing the flop. But it's not good enough for us to actually check call for showdown value. So in the middle is actually the aggressive line, funnily enough, where we decide to c-bet and just take advantage of fold equity and pot equity. And this also has the added bonus of turning our hand into a bluff on later streets as well, and sort of getting our opponent to fold marginal hands like 10x when the board runs out. One of the cards that we kind of like when we bet, like, I mean, a queen or a jack gives us more equity. Perhaps we can apply some pressure on those cards when we have the betting lead. Whereas if we check and then see the turn of those cards, check calling is not really going to be possible. We need that fold equity on the turn in order to put money into the pot on these turns that give us gut shots and things like that. So this is a spot where c-betting just sets up a hell of a better world on future streets, because you can apply fold equity, you can pick up more pot equity, make your opponent fold immediately on the flop, you can protect the equity you do have the times that you're ahead. So this is the time to c-bet. So when you totally miss the flop and it's awful, you just want to check fold when you don't have any of the good stuff. When you have some of the good stuff, like you have some pot equity and fold equity, but not that much showdown value as the hand progresses, you probably want to c-bet and go after that fold equity and try and win the pot. But let's move on to the third case now, where you actually flop something so strong by missing the flop that you think that you can start check calling. And obviously, what I'm talking about here is generic strategies. If you get player-specific reads, like Villain loves to just bet at me twice and then give up river, you know that when you flop even tier 2 showdown value, like even that 10-8-3 board, you can probably check call flop and turn and then check fold river. So you've got a very specific read that he'll bluff twice at you with his whole range and not on the river. So what I'm talking about here is when you don't have one of those reads, obviously you can branch off in more exploitative directions and take less standard lines when you learn what your opponents are doing. But for now, let's stick with the momentum of the train and move to tier 3 when we miss the flop, but we miss it in such a way that we still have the best hand a lot. Villain has a lot of air in his range, and we have sufficient showdown value to check call at least a street or two and go from there. So an example would be that we are in the big blind against the button, and we decide to 3-bet his open quite rightly with ace-king suited, and the flop comes down 6-6-3 rainbow, giving us a backdoor flush draw and 2 overcards, the sort of nutted overcards. The best non-pair that you can have here would be ace-king with the backdoor flush draw. So this hand is actually incredibly strong on this board. Yes, you've missed the flop, but your equity here is still way over 50% against your opponent's range, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Well, it's over 50% anyway, I would say. Maybe not by miles, but it should be comfortably more. And that's because it's just hard to have pocket pairs. And generally speaking, villains won't defend things like deuces through 5s or 6s to 3-bets anyway, unless you're deep, or they're a fish, or they've got some good reason to defend these bad pocket pairs that just don't have sufficient implied odds normally. Implied odds facing a 3-bet, because the 3-bet just inflates the pot too much. So they're not going to have that many pairs. Most of their range is going to be unpaired hands, big Broadway cards, aces, suited connectors, suited broadways. And on 6-6-3 rainbow, all of these hands have bricked or just flopped something similar to us, 2 overs and a backdoor flush draw, without showdown value. So given we have nutted showdown value, we can beat any hand that's not a pair here. We just have the best hand a huge amount of the time, but we also have loads of fold equity on this flop. So when we bet the 6-6-3 rainbow, our opponent's going to fold loads, and that's fine for us when we have like Jack-9. That's not a problem, we want him to fold. But when we can actually extract value with ace-king by bluff catching and check calling a hand that is A, just super strong in a headlots, and B, going to turn very nicely as well with the backdoor flush draw and things, this is a spot that is just way into the realms of check call territory. This is just where your hand is so good that you want to turn it into a bluff catcher. So it might seem weird that, well, I bet when my hand is in tier 2, missed the flop. Goodness. when I kind of have enough pot equity and fold equity, I bet that spot, but then I check a stronger hand in tier 3, when my hand is best more often. And that's completely normal and right, because in tier 2, our hand is not good enough to do that, and we want to take the pot down. And in tier 3, on the 6-6-3 board, we actually want to extract value. And the way we do that against a weak range, the way you extract value against an air-heavy range is not to go betting, it's to bluff catch. It's like if you get to the river and you think your opponent has mostly missed draws because he's played the hand in such a weird way and you have a specific read, you wouldn't want to bet a set there. You'd want to check and let him bet those missed draws. It's the same kind of idea here. When you flop just 2 overcards with ace-king, but the board is super dry and your opponent's range is super wide and you have the best hand almost, like, not always, but a lot of the time you have the best hand, like way over half the time, you definitely should be check calling. And remember that even when you don't have the best hand there, and your opponent has like 10s, 9s, jacks, etc., you still have 6 outs, whereas when he's behind you, or if you improve or whatever, he's only going to have 2. So your hand is like very versatile, it can improve, it can be good right now, it likes a lot of turn cards. It's a great check call on 6-6-3 Rainbow, especially with the backdoor flush draw. Not that the backdoor flush draw is mandatory for this, but it definitely helps. So this spot hopefully now doesn't seem so confusing. When we realise that ace-king, or any other hand for that matter when it misses the flop in lots of different ways that we can put into tiers of how happy we are with our hand and our equity and our fold equity and that kind of thing and our showdown value, we can start to recognize which of those 3 tiers we're actually in. So next time you miss the flop with ace-king, I want you to ask yourself, is this situation 1 where my hand is just so bad and everything's so negative that I need to check fold? Is it situation 2 where I've got enough pot equity and fold equity to c-bet, but I don't have enough long-term showdown value to sort of get to showdown by check calling? Or is it the third scenario where actually I just have the best hand loads and I can just play my hand as a super strong bluff catcher and check a street and maybe even value bet later on a later street? Just to summarize, remember that all of this kind of strategy is designed for you to use against someone unknown or a regular. It's not that you are not allowed to deviate from this kind of play. Like, you might flop a tier 3 hand that's usually a check call, but if your opponent's a calling station very passive fish, you of course don't want to check call, because you just rarely, if ever, want to be check calling against this player whatsoever. Against this guy who's going to bet with only better hands but call you with loads of worse ace high and king high, he's a passive calling station, you want to value bet the flop, you want to value bet the turn, you want to check fold the river probably, something like that. You don't want to take a line where you're only putting money into the pot against his strong range, his betting range. So this is for use against just an average player. When you have a great exploitative read, as always in poker, you want to be deviating and you want to be finding an even better line than this 3-tier kind of process would have you find normally. So this has been Characters for curing the spots that you hate on the Carrot Poker Podcast channel. If you're listening right now, I just want to give you guys a heads up that I'm streaming on Twitch every Tuesday and Saturday at 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. GMT at the moment. If you're watching this in like 4 years, there's a chance I might have died, or that my Twitch channel doesn't exist anymore, or I became really rich and just stopped making instructional poker content and traveled the world. But if you're watching this around 2015, then definitely that's what's going on. So please tune in to me and check out my Twitch feed and check out my website, carrotcorner.com. And if you have any questions, ideas for future episodes of Curing the Spots that you hate on the Carrot Poker Podcast, or what you'd like to see for student interviews, or if you are interested in coaching, want to find out anything from me that isn't covered on my website, then email me at admin@carrotcorner.com. So yeah, thank you very much for listening, guys. I will see you next Sunday or Monday when the next podcast comes out. So please tune in to me, and I'll see you then.